She had lived almost 9 decades, and most of those years felt like heavy chapters filled with struggle, sacrifice, and quiet pain. When she was young, she never imagined that her life would end in poverty. She had once been a music teacher who filled classrooms with laughter, talent, and hope. Students looked up to her, parents trusted her, and the sound of piano keys had been her daily companion. She lived in a small but warm home with her husband, who was a violinist. Together, they played music in a way that made strangers stop and listen. People used to say that they had magic in their hands. But life changed slowly and then all at once. Her husband fell ill and she spent everything she had trying to save him. She sold jewelry, instruments, furniture, and finally the house. The savings they had saved for old age disappeared on hospital bills that never stopped coming. When he passed away, she felt like she had lost not only a partner, but a part of her soul. Music became painful to her because every melody reminded her of the person she had lost. For weeks, she could not look at the violin without crying. She was left alone, with very little money and nowhere to live. Her daughter took her in, but even her daughter struggled with work, bills, and raising a child. The woman did not complain. She never said she was tired or sad, even when her hands stiffened with age and her bones ached. She spent her days in a small room with her few belongings stored in 2 boxes. She did not own much anymore. The world outside moved fast, and she felt forgotten by it. Her neighbors saw her as a quiet, harmless old woman sitting on a chair by the window. No one knew that she had once trained hundreds of students, written musical pieces, and performed on stages. No one would guess that her wrinkled hands were once strong and confident, moving across piano keys like rivers of sound. Now people simply walked past her, too busy to look twice. Her poverty did not come from laziness or addiction or anything shameful. It came from love, sacrifice, and a long lifetime of putting others first. She had helped her husband, her students, and her family, giving away opportunities so others could grow. She was the type of person who believed that kindness would always return. But life is not always kind to kind people. She often wondered whether she made the right choices, but she never regretted saving her husband, even if it left her with nothing. She lived on a small pension that was barely enough for daily needs. Most days, she ate simple food and wore the same clothes. She had learned to live with less, not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Yet, even in this hard life, she held on to one valuable thing: her violin. It was old, scratched, and slightly damaged, but still playable. That violin was not just wood and strings. It was a piece of her past, the last part of her husband she could touch. She kept it clean, safe, and protected like a treasure. Some nights she would sit alone, holding the violin and remembering the old days. She would close her eyes and see her husband smiling, playing beside her. She remembered their small audience clapping, her students singing, and her younger self laughing without fear. These memories were both a comfort and a sadness. They reminded her of what she had lost, but also of who she once was. Although she lived with her daughter, she felt like a burden sometimes. She tried to help around the house, but her body was weak. She could not work, cook, or walk long distances. She often stayed quiet because she did not want to trouble anyone. She had learned to hide her pain. When her back hurt, she smiled. When her heart hurt, she said nothing. She had learned that poor people, old people, and lonely people must not complain because nobody listens. But despite her suffering, she was not bitter. She believed that life, even when painful, was still a gift. She had experienced love, art, friendship, and music, which many people never get. Sometimes she would smile to herself, thinking that she had lived long enough to see the world change in unbelievable ways: cars becoming faster, computers taking over, children learning through screens. She did not understand everything, but she accepted it with patience. What hurt her the most was not hunger or loneliness, but being forgotten. She knew that people rarely think about the past of old faces. They do not imagine the stories, successes, or heartbreaks behind wrinkles. She was invisible, not because she wanted to be, but because age makes many people invisible. She wondered if anyone would remember her when she was gone, or if her entire life would disappear like dust. Yet something kept her going, a quiet hope, a tiny spark that she did not know still existed. She did not expect miracles, but she believed that life still had a lesson for her, maybe even a little joy left to offer. She did not know that soon, music would return to her life in the most unexpected way. She did not know that a 4-year-old child would change everything. Her daughter worked long hours at a job that barely paid enough to cover rent and food. She was a single mother, raising a 4-year-old girl while trying to juggle bills, schedules, and endless responsibilities. She loved her mother deeply, but she did not have the time to sit with her to listen or to understand everything she had gone through. Life moved too fast for her, and stress became her normal state. Because of this, the grandmother often spent her days alone in the small living room while the child played on the floor with toys. The little girl did not completely understand why her grandmother looked so sad or why her movements were slow. To her, the old woman was simply Nana, a gentle presence with soft hands and kind eyes. The girl talked to her sometimes, telling nonsensical stories, laughing and asking questions that made no sense, but the grandmother answered every one of them with patience and love. One afternoon, the child noticed the violin case tucked under a chair. It was old, brown, and covered in scratches, unlike the bright, colorful objects she usually played with. Children are curious by nature, and the girl was no different. She walked up to the case, touched it with tiny fingers, and asked, "What's this?" Her voice was soft, innocent, yet full of wonder. The grandmother hesitated. She had been hiding the violin not because she wanted to keep it secret, but because memories attached to it were too intense. But the little girl looked at her with wide eyes, waiting for an answer. So she lifted the case and placed it gently on the table. "It's a violin," she said softly, her voice shaking just a bit. "A very old one." The child's eyes lit up. She had never seen a violin before. She thought it looked magical, like something from a fairy tale. She did not understand its history or that it had been part of countless performances, songs, and memories. She just saw something interesting and wanted to know more. "Can you open it?" the girl asked. For a moment, the grandmother was unsure. She had not played the violin in years. The last time she held it properly was before her husband became ill. Opening the case felt like opening a door she had locked long ago. But she saw the excitement in the little girl's face, and something inside her melted. So she slowly unlatched the metal locks and opened the lid. Inside, the violin rested like a fragile piece of history. The wood was worn but still beautiful. The strings were slightly loose, but they still had life in them. The girl gasped as if she had discovered treasure. "It's so pretty," she whispered. The grandmother smiled for the first time in a long while. Not a polite smile, but a real one, the kind that reached her eyes. She felt something familiar stir in her heart, something she had not felt since her husband passed. It was not joy, it was something deeper, it was purpose. The girl pointed at the bow and asked, "What does it do?" So the grandmother showed her. She lifted the violin carefully and placed it under her chin. Her hands trembled, not only because of age, but because she feared failing or sounding terrible or being reminded too strongly of the past. But she took a deep breath and pulled the bow across the strings. The note that came out was rough, shaky, not perfect, but it was music, real music. The sound filled the tiny room, bouncing off walls, filling the air with a softness the house hadn't felt in years. The girl stared in amazement, mouth open, eyes wide, frozen like she had just seen magic happen. "Do it again," she demanded, clapping her hands. The grandmother laughed, quietly surprised at herself. It had been so long since she played. The strings made her fingers ache, but the ache felt good. It was the kind of pain that reminded her she was alive. She played a simple melody, one she used to teach beginner students. The notes were gentle, slow, and full of emotion. The little girl swayed to the music, moving her tiny body side to side, completely enchanted. She did not understand tempo, chords, or technique. She only understood feeling, and the feeling was beautiful. After the short melody ended, the girl asked, "Can I try?" The grandmother hesitated. A violin was delicate and children were unpredictable, but she could not refuse the request. Carefully, she placed the violin in the girl's arms. The instrument was almost as long as she was. It looked comical but beautiful. The girl dragged the bow across the strings, producing a loud, scratchy sound that made her giggle with delight. It was terrible, but it was perfect because it made her happy. In that moment, something changed between them. The violin was no longer just an instrument, it became a bridge. A bridge between generations, between past and present, between sorrow and joy. The grandmother began telling short stories about music, about how her husband used to play, about how she used to teach children just like her. She spoke slowly, choosing words carefully as if each word carried weight. The child didn't understand everything, but she listened, eyes big, taking in every word. Day after day, she asked for the violin. Sometimes she just wanted to hold it. Sometimes she wanted to hear a song. Sometimes she just wanted her grandmother to talk. And each time the grandmother complied, with patience, love, and a silent gratitude she never expressed aloud. Music, which once symbolized loss, began to symbolize connection. The violin, which once hurt to touch, now brought small smiles. The house, which once felt silent, began to fill with sound, some of it beautiful, some of it messy, all of it meaningful. Though neither of them realized it yet, this simple curiosity, this innocent request to open the box, marked the beginning of something extraordinary. The grandmother's life, filled with loneliness and regret, was slowly being rewritten by a child who did not know anything about sadness, but understood everything about wonder. And sometimes, wonder is enough to change a life. Each morning followed the same routine. The grandmother woke early, before the sun fully rose, moving slowly so she wouldn't disturb anyone. Her bones hurt, her back ached, and sometimes her legs trembled when she stood up. But she had grown used to discomfort. Life had taught her to walk through pain without complaining. She would make tea, sit near the window, and look outside at the quiet street, thinking about how different the world had become. But something in her mornings had changed. She no longer felt completely empty. She found herself waiting for the little girl to wake up, to run into the living room with messy hair and sleepy eyes, asking the same question. "Can we play music today?" The grandmother would smile, and her answer was always yes. In the early days, she only played tiny pieces, soft songs with a few notes, because she worried her hands couldn't handle more. Her fingers were stiff, slow, and clumsy. Sometimes the bow slipped, sometimes the sound came out wrong. Each mistake reminded her she was no longer who she once was. But each time she saw the girl's face light up with excitement, she forgot her fear for a little while. The piano in the house belonged to her daughter. It was old, slightly damaged, and several keys didn't work properly. But to the girl, it was perfect. She didn't care about broken keys or scratched wood. To her, it was a magical machine that made beautiful sounds. One day, the grandmother sat down at the piano and pressed a few keys, trying to remember a simple song from her teaching days. The sound was shaky, uneven, but familiar. The girl stood beside her, watching her fingers move over black and white keys with complete focus. "Your hands are so fast," the girl said, full of admiration. The grandmother laughed softly. "They used to be faster," she replied. She didn't mean to sound sad, but the words carried a heavy truth. Time had slowed her body, but somewhere inside, she still felt like the young teacher she once was. She thought about all the students she used to guide, the recitals she prepared them for, the nervous smiles, the proud parents. She realized she missed teaching, not just the music, but the connection. Teaching had given her purpose. Losing that purpose had left a silent wound. The little girl didn't understand any of this, but she sensed when her grandmother's voice changed, when her expression softened into something deep and distant. To cheer her up, the girl pressed a random cluster of keys loudly and laughed at the silly sound. "It sounds funny," she said. "Yes, it does," the grandmother said, laughing with her. They spent more time together now, more than either of them expected. The girl would sit on a chair, her feet too short to touch the floor, and listen to short melodies. Sometimes she asked endless questions. Why does it sound like that? How does it make music? Why are there white keys and black keys? The grandmother answered each question with patience, happy to be needed, valued, listened to. The girl's daughter, exhausted from work, didn't notice the growing bond right away. She assumed her child was just playing, and her mother was just keeping her busy. She did not see the quiet transformation happening in their lives because she was too busy surviving each day. One particular afternoon, the girl sat at the piano while the grandmother stood beside her, guiding her small hands. The girl had trouble pressing the keys gently, so everything came out loud and chaotic. But the grandmother didn't correct her harshly. She encouraged her with soft words. "Try again, slowly, like breathing." The child tried. It sounded better, not perfect, but better. And the grandmother felt a strange feeling she hadn't felt in years: hope. She began telling the girl small stories about music, not long speeches, just little memories like tiny gifts from the past. She told her how music could calm people, how it could speak without words, how it could make strangers cry or smile. The girl listened wide-eyed, absorbing every story like it was a secret. She didn't understand the depth of music, but she understood the feeling. She understood that when her grandmother played, something inside the air changed. Slowly, their time together shifted from simple play to a daily ritual. The grandmother found herself practicing again, even when the girl wasn't around. Her fingers still hurt, her hands still shook, but she pushed through it. Not because she expected to become skilled again, but because she wanted to be better for the girl. She often wondered why this child cared so much about something old, something broken, something from a world she didn't belong to. Children today had toys, screens, games, noises. They didn't care about wooden instruments or classical melodies. Yet somehow this little girl did. Maybe children see what adults forget. Maybe they notice the light in things others ignore. As days passed, the grandmother began making tiny goals. Maybe she could teach the girl a simple song. Maybe they could play together one day. Maybe something beautiful could still exist in her final years. For the first time in a long time, she had something to look forward to. Not a big dream, not a grand achievement, but a small daily joy. A pair of small hands on piano keys, a pair of bright eyes waiting for music, and a voice asking, "Can we play again?" Because sometimes, one child's curiosity is enough to awaken the pieces of a life that felt finished. And sometimes, the smallest spark can bring light back to someone who has been living in shadows for far too long. One afternoon, when the sun was shining through the window and filling the small living room with warm light, the little girl suddenly asked something unexpected. She looked up from the piano with her tiny hands still resting on the keys and said, "Can we play a song together?" Like at the same time. The grandmother froze for a second. The question was so simple yet so powerful. Playing together was different from teaching, different from practicing. It meant working as one, it meant harmony, it meant trust. She felt a wave of emotions rush through her, some beautiful, some painful. Once she had played duets with her husband. They understood each other without speaking. Their music had flowed like water, smooth and united. That part of her life was gone, buried with him. She had never imagined someone new could replace that space. But the girl looked at her with big, hopeful eyes, waiting for an answer. Children don't understand hesitation. They don't understand grief. They just ask because their hearts are bright enough not to fear disappointment. So the grandmother took a soft breath and said, "Yes, we can try." The girl squealed with excitement and bounced on her chair, which made the grandmother laugh unexpectedly. For a moment, she didn't feel like an elderly woman with a broken past. She felt like someone who still had something to offer. She began thinking of a very simple song, one with steady rhythm and easy notes, something the girl could follow without getting frustrated. She pressed a few keys slowly, letting the child listen. "This part will be yours," she said, pointing. "Just keep pressing these keys one by one gently." The girl nodded seriously, as if she had just received an important mission. Then the grandmother picked up the violin. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned it, both from age and from the fear of failure. She tightened the bow, adjusted the strings, and felt the old familiar weight settle against her shoulder. "Are you ready?" she asked. The little girl nodded, smiling with all her teeth showing. The grandmother began to play softly at first. The violin's tone was warm, fragile, but full of feeling. The girl waited for her turn, then pressed her keys too early, creating a loud, messy sound. She giggled because she could not control her excitement. The grandmother chuckled and said, "Let's try again. Watch me, listen first." They tried again. This time the girl pressed the keys with more patience. It still wasn't perfect. It was slightly offbeat, uneven, clumsy. But something magical happened. The sounds blended, not perfectly but honestly. A child's piano notes and an old woman's violin mixing into something new, something imperfect but real. The grandmother felt her heart swell. They were not performing for a crowd. They were not playing in a hall. They were just two souls, one at the beginning of life, one near the end, finding a moment where time stood still. The girl looked at her grandmother and whispered, "It feels happy." "Yes," the grandmother said, "it does." They didn't play for very long. The girl's attention wandered quickly, as children's minds often do. She got distracted by a toy, then by a butterfly outside the window. But that short moment stayed with the grandmother long after the music ended. She sat alone after the girl left, holding the violin, thinking about how such a small moment could hold so much meaning. The next day, the girl asked again, "Can we play together, like yesterday?" The grandmother hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure if her body could handle it every day. But she saw excitement in the girl's eyes, and once again she agreed. This became their new routine. Sometimes it went well. Sometimes the girl grew tired or cranky and left halfway through. Sometimes the grandmother's fingers hurt too much and she had to stop. But every day they made sound, every day they tried. The grandmother's daughter began to notice small changes. Her mother seemed livelier, she smiled more. She moved with more energy. She looked less like someone waiting for time to pass and more like someone living it. The daughter didn't understand what caused the change, but she was grateful for it. There was too much sadness in the house already. Any brightness was a blessing. Soon the girl began humming while she played. Not the correct tune, just random sounds full of joy. She had no fear of being wrong. She did not care about perfection. She only cared about fun. And the grandmother realized something profound. She had spent her whole life teaching children to play correctly, to hit the right notes, to follow the sheet music. But this girl, without training, without rules, played straight from her heart. There was beauty in that, innocent beauty. One evening when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, the grandmother sat alone with the violin. She played the same tune she had played with the girl, but slower, richer, deeper. It filled the house with sadness and hope at the same time. She didn't cry, but her eyes softened because she understood something clearly now. She had lost so much, but life was giving her one small miracle back. Not wealth, not fame, not comfort, just a chance to share music again with someone who loved her not because she was skilled, but because she was there. And sometimes that is the most meaningful kind of music. The little girl's talent began to show itself in small, unexpected ways. She remembered notes without trying. She copied rhythms after hearing them only once. She was too young to understand what talent meant, but her grandmother knew. She had taught hundreds of students of all ages, but very few had this natural connection to music. Some learned with effort, some learned with ambition, but only a few learned with instinct. And this child had instinct. Whenever the girl sat at the piano, her small fingers moved with confidence, even when she didn't know what she was doing. She pressed keys, listened to the sound, and then tried again until it felt right. She didn't need words or instructions. She learned by feeling. The grandmother watched with quiet amazement. She never imagined that someone so young, someone who could barely tie her shoes, could understand melody with such purity. It reminded her of the early days of her career, when music was exciting, when every student felt like a new story waiting to happen. She felt something awaken inside her, the teacher she used to be, the mentor who believed in potential. One afternoon, while they were practicing, the grandmother decided to test the girl gently. She played a simple tune on the violin, slow, soft, 4 notes repeating. She didn't tell the girl what to do, she just played and waited. The girl listened, head tilted, eyes focused with deep seriousness. When the tune ended, she reached for the piano and played the same 4 notes, not perfectly, but close enough to make the grandmother's heart jump. She hadn't explained anything, the child had just understood. "How did you do that?" the grandmother asked softly. The girl shrugged. "It sounded like it goes here," she said, pressing the keys again. Her answer was not logical. It was emotional. She wasn't analyzing music. She was trusting her own ears. The grandmother smiled, though her eyes filled with tears she quickly wiped away. She didn't want the girl to see her cry. Not because she was ashamed, but because she did not want to confuse her with sadness. This moment was beautiful. It deserved happiness. As the days passed, the grandmother and granddaughter spent more time playing together. Their music was still imperfect, still messy, still full of laughter and mistakes, but something meaningful was forming, a shared language without words. The girl didn't know how special it was, but the grandmother knew. She knew that this child could grow into something extraordinary if given the chance. Her daughter began to notice too, not just the musical skill but the emotional change. She noticed that her child was calmer, happier, more focused. She noticed that her mother was brighter, more awake, less distant. It was strange, she thought, how 2 generations so far apart could bring peace to each other. One day, after a long shift, she stopped in the hallway and listened from a distance. The violin played softly and the piano followed, sometimes late, sometimes loud, sometimes perfect. A small duet, fragile and honest. She leaned against the wall, exhausted, listening to the sound of her daughter learning and her mother teaching. Something warm spread through her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Life was hard, money was low, stress never stopped, but this moment felt like proof that not everything was broken. Meanwhile, the grandmother discovered something surprising about herself. She began practicing alone at night, long after everyone was asleep. She didn't do it to impress anyone. She did it because she wanted to be worthy of playing with the girl. She wanted to keep up with her curiosity, her energy, her talent. Every note hurt her fingers, but she played anyway. Every mistake frustrated her, but she didn't stop. She felt young and old at the same time. Young in her heart, old in her bones. It was both painful and beautiful. There were days when her hands refused to cooperate, days when her body reminded her that she was 90, not 19. On those days, she would sit quiet and watch the girl play alone. And each time the child would look up and ask, innocent and hopeful, "Are you okay?" "Yes, my dear," she would say, "I am just watching your magic." The girl believed her. She didn't see weakness, she only saw love. One evening, the grandmother's daughter asked her mother a simple question while washing dishes. "Why do you spend so much time teaching her?" The grandmother paused, thinking carefully. She could have said it was because the girl was talented, or because music mattered, or because it kept them busy. But she said something much simpler, something more true. "Because she brings light into my life. And I don't know how much time I have left to enjoy it." The daughter stopped scrubbing and looked at her mother. They didn't talk about aging. They didn't talk about death. They just stood close, silent, understanding something deeper than words. Meanwhile, in the living room, the little girl pressed keys, waiting for someone to play with her. "Come on, Nana," she shouted. "I'm ready." The grandmother stood up slowly, carefully, with a smile that reached her eyes. "I'm coming." And as she walked toward the piano, she realized something profound. She wasn't just teaching a child how to play music. She was teaching her how to feel it. And in return, the child was teaching her how to live again. More weeks passed, and the music in the house grew stronger, fuller, and more confident. The little girl no longer played random notes. She played patterns, rhythms, and melodies, with tiny fingers that seemed to learn faster than they could grow. She didn't understand what talent meant, but she felt something inside her whenever she played: joy, curiosity, excitement, and pride. She didn't play because she had to. She played because her heart pulled her toward sound, the way a flower turns to sunlight. The grandmother watched this transformation with a mix of awe and disbelief. She had seen talented children before, but most of them came from comfortable homes, with supportive parents, lessons, and resources. But this child was different. She had no lessons, no sheet music, no knowledge of theory. All she had was her grandmother, her ears, and her heart, and somehow it was enough. One afternoon, the grandmother decided to try something more advanced. She played a slightly faster tune on the violin and paused, waiting. The girl hesitated, then slowly pressed the matching notes on the piano. She missed the first 2, corrected herself, then played the rest almost perfectly. She looked up with a shy smile, seeking approval. "That was beautiful," the grandmother whispered, her voice trembling. The girl's smile stretched ear to ear, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she felt proud of herself. The grandmother reached out and touched her cheek gently. She didn't say it, but inside she thought, maybe you were born for this. But for every beautiful moment, life still had difficult ones. There were days when the grandmother's body betrayed her. Her hands swelled, her fingers stiffened, and the violin felt heavier than ever. She hid it from the child when possible, not wanting to worry her. But the girl noticed everything, even things adults overlooked. One day she saw her grandmother rubbing her hands, wincing as she tried to stretch her fingers. "Does it hurt?" she asked quietly. "A little," the grandmother admitted, forced into honesty. The girl thought for a moment, then climbed onto her lap and pressed a tiny kiss on her fingers as if healing them with magic. "Better now?" she asked. The grandmother laughed and cried at the same time. "Yes, much better." Children carry medicine that doctors cannot prescribe. Despite the pain, she continued playing. She practiced every night after the girl fell asleep. She wanted to stay strong, to keep up with the child, to be someone worth learning from. She knew her body was weak, but her spirit became stubborn. She refused to let age steal this miracle from her. Meanwhile, the girl's mother watched from a distance, feeling a strange mixture of emotions: joy, guilt, envy, and fear. She was happy her child and mother shared something so special, but she also envied the connection she couldn't provide. She worked too much, slept too little, and lived in a constant state of exhaustion. She wished she could give her daughter time, attention, laughter, and magic, but each day she simply survived. One evening she asked her mother quietly, "Are you overworking yourself?" The grandmother shook her head. "No. I am working because it makes me feel alive." Her daughter nodded, not fully understanding but accepting it. She realized that even in old age her mother needed purpose, and this child unknowingly had given it back to her. The girl continued improving. She began to ask deeper questions about music. Why does it sound sad? Why does this part feel happy? Why does it make my tummy feel funny? She didn't have words for emotional reactions, so she described them the only way she knew how, through sensations. The grandmother explained slowly, carefully, like telling small secrets. She told her that music held feelings, memories, and messages inside its notes. She told her that some songs were for joy, some for sorrow, some for love, some for goodbye. The girl listened as if she was hearing fairy tales. Sometimes she would play random keys and ask, "What feeling is this?" And sometimes the grandmother couldn't help but laugh because the child's chaotic notes sounded like confusion more than emotion. But in every question she sensed potential. The girl wasn't just playing, she was thinking about music, feeling music, trying to understand it, and that more than talent was rare. One night when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, the grandmother sat on the couch, holding the violin gently in her lap. She stared at it, thinking about all it had seen: youth, love, marriage, sorrow, loss, loneliness, and now rebirth. She touched the strings with fragile fingertips and whispered, "Thank you for staying with me." She knew she could not play forever. Her time, her strength, her body, they were slipping away little by little. But she didn't feel sadness. She felt gratitude, because life had given her one last chance to share music with someone worthy of it. Not for applause, not for fame, not for money, but for love. In the room next door, the little girl slept with one small hand resting on the piano keys, as if afraid the music would disappear if she let go. And the grandmother smiled because she understood. The child was holding onto more than an instrument. She was holding onto a legacy. And soon, that legacy would need to be passed on. The living room had become a small music studio. There were crayons, toys, and crumbs on the floor, but there was also sound that grew stronger each day. The girl's progress surprised her grandmother more than she ever admitted. What started as playful noise was now something close to music, real music. Sometimes the grandmother would close her eyes while the girl played, not because she needed to rest, but because she wanted to feel the sound without watching. It reminded her of the days when she used to listen to her husband practice, their house filled with life and laughter. One morning, the girl sat at the piano and said confidently, "Let's play together like a concert." She didn't fully understand what a concert was, but she liked the idea of doing something grand. The grandmother smiled, both amused and touched. "A concert, huh? Who will be our audience?" The girl thought for a moment, then announced proudly, "Mama will watch, and maybe the cat if he doesn't run away." That afternoon, while her mother cooked a simple dinner, the girl ran to her and said, "Mama, come sit. We are doing a concert." The mother wiped her hands on a towel, tired but unable to refuse the excitement in her child's voice. She sat on the couch, curious and expectant, while the grandmother stood at the piano, violin in hand. The girl lifted her small hands and began to play the simple tune they had practiced. She focused hard, tongue sticking out slightly, eyebrows furrowed with determination. The grandmother joined with the violin, guiding her with soft, steady notes. It wasn't perfect. Some notes clashed, some came too early, and the grandmother's hands trembled visibly during difficult parts. But somehow the imperfection made it beautiful. It wasn't a performance. It was a moment of connection. The mother watched silently, eyes filling with tears. She had lived so long in a world of exhaustion, bills, deadlines, and fear of failing her child that she had forgotten what beauty looked like. She didn't see mistakes. She saw two generations reaching across time to make something meaningful. When the song ended, the girl looked up, waiting for applause, and the mother clapped with genuine joy. The little girl laughed, proud and shy at the same time. The grandmother bowed dramatically, pretending to be professional, which made the girl giggle even more. Afterward, the mother hugged her child and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." But when she turned to her mother, she hugged her too, longer and tighter than usual. "Thank you," she said softly. The grandmother didn't ask for what she knew. Days later, the girl's confidence grew even more. She began creating little melodies of her own, pressing keys in patterns she thought sounded interesting. Sometimes she would say, "Listen, Nana, I made a new song." And even though the song was just 5 or 6 uneven notes, the grandmother listened like it was a masterpiece. She didn't correct or judge. Children don't need judgment to grow, they need encouragement, freedom, and love. But as the girl's talent grew, the grandmother's health became more unpredictable. There were days when her fingers hurt so much she could not hold the bow. Days when her joints swelled, knees locked, breath shortened. She tried to hide it, pretending she was just tired or needed a break. But the child wasn't fooled. One evening, she sat beside her grandmother and said, "You don't have to play if it hurts." The grandmother looked at her, surprised by the child's empathy. "It's okay," she whispered. "I want to play." The girl thought for a moment, then answered with the wisdom of someone much older than 4 years. "You play when you want, and when you don't want, I will play for you." The grandmother felt something inside her soften, almost break. She reached out and kissed the girl's forehead. "Thank you, my love." Music changed from a lesson to a language between them. They no longer needed instructions or explanations. They simply understood each other through sound, silence, smiles, and tears. One night, the grandmother sat alone in the living room, staring at the violin resting on the table. She wondered how long she would be able to play, how long she would hear these notes, how many more mornings she would wake to see the girl's hopeful face. The thought scared her. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of leaving too soon, before passing on everything she wanted to share. She whispered into the quiet room, "I wish I had more time." Across the hallway, the girl slept peacefully, unaware of the fragile nature of life. She dreamed of music, laughter, and concerts with her grandmother. In her dreams, nothing ever ended. Meanwhile, the grandmother sat with memories flooding back of her husband, their performances, the applause, the pride, the love. She realized something profound. She had spent years grieving what she lost, but now she was finally celebrating what she had left. And what she had left was beautiful. A child who loved her, a daughter who needed her. A melody still inside her fingers. A few more days, weeks, or months to give everything she could before time took it away. She lifted the violin one last time that night and played a lullaby, slow and soft, not for an audience, but for the sleeping child who had given her a reason to wake up every morning. And as the final note faded into silence, she whispered, "Thank you for finding me." The final days of that summer were quiet, warm, and golden. The little girl still woke up every morning asking, "Can we play music today?" And the grandmother still answered yes, even when her body protested. Their music became slower, softer, less like a performance and more like a prayer. The girl didn't notice the change, but the grandmother did. Each note felt heavier, harder to produce, but also more meaningful. She knew her time was getting shorter, not because a doctor said so, but because her body whispered it. One afternoon, while her daughter was at work, the grandmother sat on the couch and watched the girl play piano by herself. The child hummed happily, pressing keys with gentle curiosity, creating little songs that made no sense and perfect sense at the same time. The grandmother smiled, feeling both joy and sorrow at once. She wished she could stay longer, watch the child grow, guide her, protect her. But life didn't ask for permission, and time didn't slow down for anyone, not even for love. She decided to teach the girl something simple, something small, something she could carry with her long after the grandmother was gone. She sat beside her on the piano bench and said softly, "Do you want to learn a special song?" The girl nodded, eyes wide with excitement, unaware of the meaning behind the moment. The grandmother placed her hands on the keys and played a melody she had written when she was young, a simple tune filled with softness, hope, and longing. The girl listened carefully, watching every movement. Then she tried it herself slowly, unevenly, but with determination. They practiced it together every day for a week, short, messy practices filled with laughter, stubbornness, mistakes, and tiny successes. By the 7th day, the girl played it almost perfectly. "You did it," the grandmother whispered, tears in her eyes. The girl looked up proudly, expecting praise, but instead saw sadness. She tilted her head and asked, "Why are you crying?" The grandmother smiled, though her voice shook. "Because your music is beautiful." The child accepted the answer without understanding the depth behind it. That night, when everyone was asleep, the grandmother sat alone, holding the violin one last time. She didn't play, she just held it against her chest, feeling the familiar shape, remembering everything it meant: love, loss, youth, hope, purpose. She kissed it gently, then placed it on the table as if saying goodbye. The next morning she didn't wake up. There was no drama, no struggle, no sound, just silence. Soft, peaceful silence. Her daughter found her sitting in her chair, eyes closed, hands resting gently in her lap like she had fallen asleep while waiting for music. The house felt different that day. Even the sunlight seemed softer. The little girl didn't understand death, not really. She only understood that Nana wasn't waking up. She tried shaking her, whispering her name, asking her to play the special song, but the grandmother didn't move. When the girl realized her grandmother would never answer again, she cried so hard that her mother had to hold her close, whispering comfort through her own tears. The days that followed were heavy with silence. The violin stayed on the table untouched. The piano keys stayed still. The little girl didn't want to play. Music felt confusing now, too big, too sad, too full of questions she didn't know how to ask. Weeks passed and grief settled like dust. The grandmother's daughter tried her best to stay strong for her child, but sometimes she cried quietly at night, remembering the sound of violin and piano filling their small home. She wished she had listened longer, hugged harder, said more. She wished she had thanked her mother for everything she rebuilt from nothing. One afternoon, the little girl sat at the piano, staring at the keys. She didn't touch them at first. She just stared, thinking of the songs her grandmother taught her. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her fingers on the keys and played the special melody, the one they practiced together. The notes were shaky, emotional, imperfect, but the moment was full. Her mother, hearing it from the kitchen, froze. She leaned against the wall, listening with tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The child played through the whole song, and when it ended, she whispered, "This is Nana's song, I won't forget." Years passed, the girl grew older, and music followed her everywhere. She played in school bands, talent shows, community events. Every teacher who heard her said she had something rare: sensitivity, natural rhythm, emotional depth. People assumed she came from a musical family, but she never explained the full story. She didn't talk about the tiny apartment, the broken piano, the old violin, or the 87-year-old woman who believed in her before anyone else did. But whenever someone asked her where her love for music came from, she would smile softly and say, "Someone very special taught me." In time, she played that special song at recitals on grand pianos in bright halls. People clapped, moved by the beauty, unaware that they were hearing a memory, a goodbye, a gift. And each time she played it, she felt something warm beside her, like a presence, like a whisper, like a hand guiding hers. Music had become part of her identity, not because she wanted applause, but because it kept her connected to the person who gave her love, purpose, and belief. And although the grandmother was gone, her music did not die. It lived in every note the girl played, every song she created, every emotion she shared with the world. Because love, real love, leaves echoes. And sometimes those echoes sound like music. Those echoes sound like music.